At 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, my phone buzzed in the cup holder with a notification from my wife. Just got to Sarah's house. Missing you already. See you Sunday. I stared at the screen for a long second, then looked back through my windshield toward the entrance of the Grandview Hotel directly across the street. My heart didn't just drop, it felt like it had been surgically removed. Lauren was standing under the gold-trimmed awning, her long blonde hair catching the afternoon sun as she laughed. But she wasn't with her sister. She was with Ryan Calloway, my business partner and the man I'd called my best friend for 20 years. I watched as he placed a confident, polished hand on the small of her back and guided her through the revolving doors. I was halfway out of my car, my hands shaking with a project manager's instinct to confront the chaos, when a sharp tap on my window stopped me. A hotel valet was leaning down, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask for my keys. He just whispered, "Don't go in there yet, Mr. Marshall. You're looking at the scene, but you haven't seen the blueprint. Something much bigger is about to collapse." I am so incredibly grateful that you've joined me to hear how I navigated the most difficult project of my life. If this story resonates with you or reminds you to trust your own instincts, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from, your city, your country. It truly means a lot to connect with you all. A quick note before we dive in. While this story contains fictional elements for educational purposes, the lessons regarding trust, financial awareness, and resilience are very real. Now, let me tell you exactly how the foundation of my life began to crack. It started on the morning of June 12th, a sweltering Tuesday that marked exactly 15 years since Lauren and I stood in a small garden in Vermont and promised to be each other's North Star. As a project manager, I live by schedules and transparency, so I had started my day at 6 a.m., clearing my desk so I could surprise Lauren with a weekend getaway to celebrate my latest real estate development deal. I spent the morning reviewing ledgers and site plans, fueled by the thought of the life we were building together. I had no idea that while I was meticulously planning our future, the two people I trusted most were already busy tearing it down, brick by brick. The valet's hand stayed on my window for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes scanning the street before returning to mine. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with a name tag that read Leo, but there was a weariness in his gaze that suggested he'd seen more than his fair share of the city's underside. I stayed frozen in the driver's seat, my hand still white-knuckled on the door handle, the "missing you" text from Lauren still glowing like a neon brand on my phone. "I've seen you here before, haven't I?" Leo asked softly. "Not at the hotel but in the news. The Marshall Heights project." I nodded slowly, my voice feeling like it was trapped behind a wall of glass. "I'm the lead manager." Leo sighed, leaning in closer. "Then you deserve better than what's happening in Suite 402. Look, Mr. Marshall, I'm not supposed to talk to the guests, especially the ones who aren't staying here, but I've watched that silver Porsche and your wife's SUV pull up here every Tuesday and Thursday for the last 4 months. They don't even hide it anymore. They think because they tip well, the staff is blind." For months. The number hit me harder than the image of them kissing. For months ago, I was working 16-hour days to secure the permits for the development. For months ago, Ryan had sat at my kitchen table, drinking my scotch and telling me how proud he was of our partnership. Lauren had been right there, nodding, her hand resting on my shoulder in a show of support that I now realized was nothing more than a calculated performance. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my project manager's mind finally starting to click back into gear, searching for the motive. Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metallic object, a valet's spare key tag with a room number scribbled on it in permanent marker. "Because last week, I overheard them in the lobby. They weren't talking about romance, Mr. Marshall. They were talking about liquidating assets and a permanent exit. They mentioned your name, and they didn't sound like people who were worried about your well-being. They sounded like people who were waiting for a building to burn down so they could collect the insurance." He dropped the tag into my open palm. It felt cold, a heavy piece of evidence that shifted the entire foundation of my reality. This wasn't just a betrayal of the heart, it was a professional execution. My wife and my best friend weren't just escaping for a weekend, they were planning a vanishing act, and I was the one they were planning to leave behind in the rubble. The suite is booked under Ryan Calloway's corporate account, Leo added, stepping back as a black sedan pulled into the driveway. If you want the truth, don't look in their pockets. Look in their paperwork. I looked down at the tag, then back at the hotel's revolving doors. The calm and responsible Kevin Marshall wanted to scream, but the project manager in me, the man who knew how to handle a crisis, took a deep, steadying breath. I put the car in gear, but I didn't drive toward the entrance. I drove away. I didn't need a scene, I needed a strategy. The hunt had officially begun. The drive back to our suburban home was a blur of calculated turns and mechanical breathing. Every red light felt like an interrogation, a pause that forced me to look at the empty passenger seat where Lauren usually sat, humming along to the radio. I kept glancing at the valet's key tag sitting in my console, a small, jagged piece of metal that had punctured the lung of my reality. As a project manager, I am trained to look for structural integrity, and right now, the foundation of my entire life was liquefying into a sinkhole. Stepping into our house, the silence was deafening. It was a beautiful, curated space, long-grain oak floors, expensive minimalist art, and the faint, lingering scent of Lauren's vanilla perfume. It felt like a high-end stage set where the lead actors had already fled the production. I went straight to the home office, a room we shared but rarely occupied at the same time. My hands were steady as I powered up the central server. We used a shared cloud for everything: tax returns, renovation blueprints, and vacation photos. I had built the architecture of this digital filing system myself, and I knew every corner of it. Or so I thought. I began by running a simple diagnostic on the storage metadata. In any large-scale project, if money or time is missing, there's always a ghost file, a discrepancy that doesn't add up. I found it tucked behind a folder labeled Garden Landscapes 2022. It was a hidden partition, encrypted with a password I didn't recognize. I tried our wedding date. Incorrect. I tried Lauren's birthday. Incorrect. Then, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I typed in the date Ryan and I had signed our partnership incorporation papers. The folder snapped open. Inside was a subfolder titled New Horizon. My heart hammered against my ribs as I clicked through the PDF files. They weren't garden plans. They were 2 first-class, one-way tickets to the Maldives, departing in exactly 3 weeks. The names on the boarding passes stared back at me in clinical, sans serif font: Lauren Marshall and Ryan Calloway. Beneath the tickets was a digital scan of a property deed for a villa in Mafushi. It hadn't been bought with a mortgage, it was a cash purchase. The amount, $1.2 million, matched the exact budget overage Ryan had claimed we hit on the foundational phase of the Heights project last month. I sat back, the blue light of the monitor washing over my face. This wasn't just a weekend tryst at a local hotel. This was an extraction. Lauren hadn't just been distant. She had been packing a life I didn't know we were leaving. I realized then that the woman I shared a bed with was a digital ghost, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs that led to a paradise bought with my reputation. I didn't close the laptop. Instead, I pulled out my own encrypted drive. In project management, when a structure is compromised beyond repair, you don't try to patch it. You perform a controlled demolition. The digital trail in the Maldives folder was the map, but the project ledgers were the crime scene. I spent the next 4 hours buried in the financial architecture of the Marshall Heights project, the very development that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of my career. As a project manager, I see numbers as more than just currency. They are the pulse of a building's health. And right now, the pulse of my project was erratic, bleeding out through wounds I hadn't noticed because I was too busy trusting the man holding the scalpel. I pulled up the quarterly expenditure reports, cross-referencing our material orders against the on-site delivery logs. That's when the anomalies began to surface, small, jagged inconsistencies that a casual auditor might miss, but to me, they were as glaring as a cracked load-bearing wall. There were recurring payments to a company called Callaway Logistics and Supply. On the surface, it looked like a standard subcontracting arrangement for heavy machinery, but as I dug deeper into the Secretary of State's business filings, the structural integrity of the lie collapsed. The company had been registered only 6 months ago to a P.O. box in Delaware. The authorized signer wasn't Ryan. It was a shell corporation managed by a law firm that Lauren had used for her boutique's consulting work. My best friend was siphoning the project's oxygen, and my wife was holding the tank. I traced a $3 million wire transfer labeled structural steel reinforcement. I remembered that day clearly. Ryan had come into my office looking haggard, claiming the global supply chain had spiked prices and we needed to pay a premium to stay on schedule. I had signed the authorization without a second thought, moved by his apparent stress and our decade-long history. Now, looking at the digital ledger, I saw that while the money had left our firm's account, not a single pound of steel had arrived at the Heights. Instead, the funds had been diverted through Callaway Logistics and vanished into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The betrayal was surgical. Ryan wasn't just stealing, he was sabotaging the project's viability. By inflating costs and creating ghost vendors, he was making the firm look like it was failing, driving down the value of my personal shares. It was a classic squeeze play. They didn't just want the money for their island paradise. They wanted to bankrupt me so I wouldn't have the resources to fight back when the mental instability claims eventually hit the courts. I leaned back, the hum of the cooling fan on my laptop the only sound in the dark office. I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. In construction, when you find a nest of termites, you don't just spray the surface, you track them back to the queen. I began to build my own ledger, a shadow file of every ghost payment, every forged invoice, and every lie Ryan had told me over a beer. They thought I was the mark, but they forgot one thing. I'm the one who built the foundation. And I'm the only one who knows exactly where to pull the pin to bring the whole thing down on their heads. The deeper I drifted into the digital archives of our shared life, the more the air in the office seemed to thin. I had already found the stolen millions and the one-way tickets to a stolen paradise, but as a project manager, I knew that every successful heist required a diversion, a reason for the victim not to follow. I found that diversion buried in a password-protected PDF labeled Medical Correspondence, Confidential. My hands, usually so steady when reviewing complex blueprints, began to tremble as the document loaded. It was a draft of a formal evaluation on the letterhead of Dr. Eris Thorne, a psychiatrist whose name I had never heard and whose office I had certainly never stepped foot in. The letter was addressed to the Regional Board of Directors and the state's licensing board. To whom it may concern, the text began, I am writing to express my escalating concerns regarding the cognitive health and emotional stability of Mr. Kevin Marshall. I read the words twice, my vision blurring. The letter detailed a series of fabricated incidents, extreme memory lapses, bouts of unprovoked aggression at home, and a progressive detachment from reality that made me a liability to the multimillion-dollar Marshall Heights project. It suggested that I was suffering from early-onset cognitive decline exacerbated by professional burnout. Most chillingly, there were witness statements attached. Lauren had meticulously documented dates and times where I had supposedly forgotten major life events or lost my temper, moments that, in reality, were quiet evenings we had spent watching movies or discussing our future. She wasn't just stealing my money, she was stealing my mind. I realized with a jolt of cold terror that this was the blueprint the valet had warned me about. If Lauren could successfully paint me as mentally incompetent, she wouldn't need me to sign the power of attorney forms, she could simply have a court grant them to her. She and Ryan weren't just running away, they were making sure that by the time I realized I'd been robbed, no one would believe a word I said. I would be a man shouting into a void, trapped in a cage built of medical lies and forged signatures. I leaned back, staring at the blinking cursor on the screen. The betrayal had moved beyond greed into something predatory. In construction, if a structural report is falsified, the entire building is condemned. Lauren was trying to condemn me. But as I saved the draft of that letter to my own encrypted drive, a new kind of resolve hardened in my chest. They wanted a man who was losing his grip on reality? I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would play the part of the crumbling man until the very moment the trap snapped shut, ensuring that when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't just be a medical report, it would be a verdict. The front door clicked shut at precisely 6:30 p.m., the familiar sound now echoing like a gavel in the silence of the foyer. I remained in the kitchen, carefully dicing onions for a dinner I had no intention of enjoying. My movements were rhythmic and precise, a project manager's habit, even as my pulse hammered against my collarbone. "Kevin? Honey, are you in here?" Lauren's voice was a melody of practiced warmth as she rounded the corner. She looked radiant, her blonde hair perfectly tousled from the sister's trip she had never actually taken. She stepped toward me, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my forehead with a touch that felt like a brand. "You look exhausted. Did you stay at the office late again?" "Just catching up on some paperwork for the Heights project," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on the cutting board. My voice was level, a feat of engineering I didn't know I was capable of. She let out a soft, rehearsed sigh, leaning against the counter just inches from me. "That's exactly what I'm worried about, Kev. You're overextending yourself. Honestly, I'm starting to get scared." She paused, her striking blue eyes wide with a mask of profound concern. "Like last night, when you called me from the office asking where the car keys were, even though they were in your hand? And then this morning, you forgot we had that brunch scheduled with the Callaways." I hadn't called her about keys, and there had been no brunch. This was the opening move, the verbal foundation for the medical letter I'd found on the server. She was gaslighting me in real time, testing the structural integrity of my composure. "I don't recall a brunch, Lauren," I said, finally looking up. I made sure to let a flicker of confusion cross my face, a calculated crack in the armor. "See? That's what I mean." She reached for my hand, her grip soft and predatory. "It's the stress, honey. Ryan mentioned you've been acting erratic at the site too. Misplacing invoices, snapping at the foreman. We're both so worried. Maybe it's time to let Ryan take over the financial oversight for a few weeks? Just until you find your feet again." The audacity of it was breathtaking. She was asking me to hand the keys to the kingdom to the man who was already looting the treasury. Watching her, I realized how much of our marriage had been a simulation. She wasn't a partner, she was a demolition expert. "Maybe you're right," I whispered, forced a slight tremor into my hand. "Maybe I am just tired." "Of course you are," she cooed, stepping into my space to wrap her arms around my neck. As she pressed her cheek against mine, I could smell the faint, metallic scent of the hotel's luxury soap on her skin. She thought she was comforting a man who was breaking. She had no idea she was holding a man who was finally, for the first time in 15 years, seeing the world with absolute, terrifying clarity. I didn't pull away. I simply held her back, staring over her shoulder at the darkened window, counting the seconds until I could begin the next phase of the collapse. The following afternoon, the glass doors of my office swung open with a familiar, practiced confidence. Ryan Calloway sauntered in, looking every bit the successful entrepreneur in a tailored charcoal suit, his black hair styled to perfection. He carried 2 tumblers of high-end scotch and a smile that had fooled me for 2 decades. "To the man of the hour," Ryan said, his voice booming with a warmth that now sounded like the hiss of a fuse. He set a glass on my mahogany desk and raised his own. "To the Marshall Heights project. Nearly at the finish line, brother. I couldn't have done it without you." I watched him across the desk, my project manager's eye dissecting the scene. I noticed the way he checked his reflection in the window, but my focus caught on his wrist. As he tilted the glass, a familiar timepiece slid from beneath his cuff, a limited edition Patek Philippe with a rose gold face. I had bought that watch for his 40th birthday, a gesture of brotherhood after we closed our first major deal. Now, knowing what I knew about Callaway Logistics and the ghost vendors, I realized that even my gifts to him had likely been funded by the very money he was siphoning out of my pockets. The irony was a bitter swallow. "You okay, Kev?" Ryan asked, his observant eyes narrowing slightly. He stepped closer, leaning over the desk with a look of rehearsed concern that mirrored Lauren's from the night before. "Lauren called me. She sounds really worried, man. Said you've been foggy. Forgetting the small stuff. I told her it's just the pressure of the build, but seeing you now? You look 1,000 miles away." "Just a lot of moving parts, Ryan," I replied, my voice a masterpiece of forced exhaustion. I let my hand tremble slightly as I reached for the scotch, playing the part of the crumbling man they so desperately needed me to be. I feel like I'm losing track of the schedule. The structural steel invoices. I could have sworn I signed them, but the site foreman says they're missing. Ryan's face softened into a mask of predatory sympathy. He reached out and squeezed my shoulder, his grip firm and brotherly. Don't sweat the paperwork, brother. That's what I'm here for. Why don't you head home early? Let me handle the financial audit for the next few days. I'll keep the board off your back while you get some rest. You've earned it. As he spoke, the light caught the sapphire crystal of the watch on his wrist. He was standing there, toast in hand, wearing a symbol of my loyalty while actively trying to bury my career and my sanity. It was the ultimate sabotage, not just of a building but of a soul. Thanks, Ryan, I whispered, looking down at the amber liquid in my glass. I don't know what I'd do without a friend like you. Always got your back, Kev, he said, turning toward the door with a triumphant gait. I waited until the click of the door signaled his departure before I tipped the scotch into the potted plant in the corner. I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a single, encrypted message to the private investigator I'd hired that morning. The mark is moving. Follow the watch. The toast was over. Now, it was time for the reckoning. The house was quiet when I returned, the kind of silence that precedes a controlled demolition. Lauren was out, likely scouting locations for the boutique she'd never open, giving me the window I needed. I didn't head for our shared office this time. Instead, I retreated to the basement workshop, where a secondary, offline workstation sat beneath a stack of old architectural physical models. As a project manager, I knew that every contract has a fail-safe, a clause designed to protect the integrity of the build if the lead engineer is compromised. I logged into the firm's private legal portal using an administrative bypass I'd set up years ago for emergencies. My hands didn't shake, they moved with the cold, clinical efficiency of a man dismantling a bomb. I began drafting an amendment to the Marshall Heights operating agreement. It was a masterpiece of technical obfuscation. To a casual observer, it looked like a standard update to our liability insurance. But buried deep within the legalese of Section 14.2 was a poison pill. I restructured the project's governance so that any move to declare the lead manager, myself, mentally or physically incapacitated would automatically trigger a forensic integrity audit. This wasn't just a simple review of the books. I linked the trigger to an external third-party auditing firm I'd already retained in secret. The moment Lauren and Ryan filed that forged psychiatric letter or attempted to exercise a power of attorney, the audit would go live. It would bypass our internal servers and scrape every transaction from the last 24 months, including the ghost vendor payments to Callaway Logistics. I was effectively turning their own weapon against them. The harder they pushed to prove I was unfit, the faster the door to their prison cell would swing shut. I spent the next hour digitally signing and time-stamping the documents, ensuring they were mirrored on 3 different secure servers. I also added a final succession clause. In the event of my removal, all project assets would be frozen and placed into a blind trust managed by my grandmother's estate lawyer, a man who knew exactly what Ryan was capable of. By the time I powered down the monitor, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the workshop floor. I felt a strange sense of peace. I had spent 15 years building a life on a foundation of trust, only to find it was made of sand. But this new blueprint, this one was made of reinforced steel and cold, hard truth. I heard Lauren's car pull into the driveway. I tucked my encrypted drive into my pocket and smoothed my shirt. The trap was set. The structural reinforcements were in place. All I had to do now was wait for them to try and take me down, unaware that the moment they pulled the trigger, they would be the ones caught in the crossfire. I walked upstairs to greet my wife, the foggy husband they expected, hidden behind a mask of perfect, quiet resilience. The ballroom of the Grandview Hotel was a sea of crystal and calculated smiles. This was the New Horizon Gala, the official launch of our final development phase, or so Lauren and Ryan believed. They stood at the center of the room, the perfect image of a supportive wife and a loyal partner, holding court with the board of directors and the city's most influential investors. I watched them from the periphery, my hand resting on a leather-bound folder. You ready, Kev? Ryan stepped toward me, his Patek Philippe gleaming under the chandeliers. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Lauren told me you had a bit of a moment in the car. If you can't get through the speech, just say the word. I've got the backup draft ready. I'm perfectly clear, Ryan, I said, offering a small, enigmatic smile. In fact, I've never felt more focused. Lauren joined us, sliding her arm through mine, her perfume a suffocating cloud of vanilla. We're all here for you, honey. Just remember what we talked about. Don't overexert yourself. She squeezed my arm, a final check of the foggy man she thought she had successfully dismantled. I walked to the podium, the clinking of silverware dying down. I looked out at the faces, the people these two valued above all else. The elite, the powerful, the mirrors they used to validate their own reflection. 15 years ago, I began, my voice amplified and steady. I started building a legacy based on a single principle: structural integrity. You can't build something that lasts if the foundation is hollow. I paused, catching Lauren's confused blink from the front table. Tonight was supposed to be about a new beginning. And in a way it is. I've prepared a special presentation, a blueprint of the true costs of our success. The lights dimmed, but instead of the promotional video from Marshall Heights, the massive screens behind me flickered to life with the Callaway Logistics bank ledgers. $3 million wire transfers to a shell company in Delaware scrolled by in high definition. The room went silent. What is this? Ryan hissed, half rising from his chair. This is the gift, I promised, I said, my voice cutting through the rising murmurs. I opened the leather folder and began to read. I didn't read about the affair. I read the forged medical letter from Dr. Thorne. I read the one-way flight numbers to the Maldives. I displayed the property deed for the villa bought with stolen project funds. The board members gasped as the Forensic Integrity Audit logo appeared on the screen, accompanied by a real-time notification that the state's fraud bureau had received the full digital packet 10 minutes prior. I looked directly at Lauren, whose face had drained of all color, and then at Ryan, who was frantically checking his watch as if it could tell him how much time he had left before the police arrived. The audit is live, I announced to the room, but mostly to them. And as per the revised operating agreement, the Marshall Heights project is officially frozen. You wanted to prove I was unfit to manage my assets? You succeeded. I've transferred everything into a blind trust. You can't touch the money, you can't touch the project, and as of 5 minutes ago, you can't touch the exit. I stepped down from the podium, leaving the folder on the lectern. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of their lies. I felt the lightness of a man who had finally cleared the site of its rot. As the first blue and red lights began to flash against the ballroom windows, I walked past my wife and my best friend without a word. The grand unveiling was complete. The flashing lights of the patrol cars eventually faded into the city's steady hum, leaving the Grandview Hotel in a stunned, heavy silence. In the weeks that followed, the new horizon they had planned became a landscape of depositions and discovery motions. Ryan Callaway's styled confidence withered behind the glass of a visitation room as the federal wire fraud and embezzlement charges mounted. Lauren's elegant mask shattered under the weight of the forensic audit, her attempts to portray me as unstable becoming the very evidence of her own predatory intent. Without the stolen millions to fund their escape, the paradise they had built on a foundation of lies simply evaporated, leaving them to face the cold, clinical reality of the justice system. 6 months later, I stood on the penthouse balcony of the completed Marshall Heights project. The glass and steel rose around me, solid and unyielding, a physical testament to a structure that had survived its own attempted demolition. The sunset painted the skyline in bruised purples and golds, reflecting off the windows of a building that was now entirely mine. I had spent 20 years building things for other people, for a we that turned out to be a them, but this time, the achievement felt different. It felt quiet. I pulled my phone from my pocket and looked at the lock screen, a photo of the Vermont garden where I had once stood with a woman I thought I knew. I deleted the file, the digital ghost finally laid to rest. There was no rage left, only the profound, steady clarity of a man who had survived a storm and learned to read the clouds. As a project manager, I used to think the most important part of a build was the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Now I knew better. The most important part was the integrity of the hidden things, the rebar, the footings, and the truth of the people standing beside you. I took a deep breath of the crisp evening air, feeling the weight of the last 15 years finally lift from my shoulders. The sight was clear. The rot was gone. I walked back inside, closing the heavy glass door behind me, ready to start the only project that truly mattered, building a life defined by the truth. Standing here on the balcony of my completed project, looking out at the city I helped build, I realized that the most dangerous cracks in a structure aren't the ones you can see on the surface. They're the ones hidden in the foundation, in the people you choose to trust with your life and your legacy. If there is one thing I want you to take away from my journey, it's this: your intuition is the most precise instrument you own. As a project manager, I was trained to look at data, schedules, and blueprints. I ignored the flickers in my gut because I wanted to believe in the stability of my marriage and my friendship. But betrayal doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in a text message that doesn't match the view from your window or a forged signature on a medical form. Don't ever let your love for someone make you blind to the truth of who they are. Protecting yourself isn't about being cynical, it's about having structural integrity. Document the anomalies. Audit your inner circle. And when you feel that first chill of doubt, don't look away, look closer. Because the moment you stop questioning the glitches in your reality is the moment you give others permission to dismantle it. I survived this controlled demolition because I stopped being a passive observer and started being the lead engineer of my own life. I want to help you do the same. If this story opened your eyes or helped you see the ghost vendors in your own life, I'd love for you to join this community. We're more than just a channel, we're a group of people committed to resilience, truth, and the art of the comeback. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into stories of justice and transformation. Let's build something together that no one can tear down. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. I'm reading every single one. Stay sharp, stay observant, and I'll see you in the next video.